Hello, everyone. I'm Fred Tangeman, Director of Communications at the Presbyterian Historical Society. I'm joined today by Dr. Thomas G. Nimick, who is Professor of History at the U.S. Military Academy in West Point. Tom is a ruling elder at Germans Presbyterian Church in New City, New York. He's published on the administrative history of Ming Dynasty China, including local administration in Ming China, the changing roles of magistrates, prefects, and provincial officials. He's currently working on a biography of Mary Morrison and on an account of Presbyterian polity at work in the early days of the Presbyterian mission in Ningbo, China. So Tom, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here with you.
So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be having a discussion about the recent article that Tom has contributed to the Journal of Presbyterian History. That article is titled Missionary Women's Outreach to Poor Women in China, Origins of the Industrial Class Strategy. That appears in the spring-summer 2020 Journal of Presbyterian History. And for those of you who don't know, the journal is the scholarly publication of the Presbyterian Historical Society. It's edited by two lead editors, Jim Moorhead and Nancy J. Taylor. And Nancy, as again, I think many of you know, is PHS's executive director. So Tom, the first question I had for you is a little bit of something that sets the stage for the story that you cover so well in your article, and that's about Mary Morrison. Your article focuses on the experiences that Mary had in the city of Ningbo in the mid-19th century. So can you start by telling us a little bit about Mary before she and her husband Thomas arrived in China in December 1859, and also a little bit about how prepared or maybe unprepared Mary might have been for life in China and as a missionary?
So Mary grew up in Elizabeth, New Jersey. She was a member in good standing of the First Presbyterian Church in Elizabeth. She had a pastor who encouraged the young people to think about the possibility of mission. He had served as a home missionary. At the same time, she was a very strong-willed individual and had taken the initiative on her own after finishing her schooling to set up an elementary school for girls with her younger sister in the city of Elizabeth. She then went to the, what was a new phenomenon at the time, normal school, teacher's college in Albany, New York. And as best we can tell, was actually spent some time teaching in the New York City schools before she met her husband, Thomas. So she was interested in mission, and he had just dedicated himself to mission, and they were appointed by the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions to go together to China. They would have had no language training before they went because it wasn't available. China was recently opened. In 1844, the mission had been established in the city, so there were people already there who could orient them. But it was still a big step to go on the 3-month voyage off to China after being newly married and arriving in this treaty port city. And we'll probably get back to the circumstances there. But so she was ready for mission. She was interested in mission. She shared that interest with her husband, and off they went.
So we have a broad understanding of the goals of missionaries in the 19th century, chiefly among those converting members of the local community to Christianity. What particular goals were Thomas and Mary Morrison tasked with achieving, and how did Mary's goals coincide or depart from her husband's goals?
So by 1860, the leaders of the Presbyterian mission work knew that it was very hard for men to reach out to women in Chinese society. That had to do with their social norms and the difficulty of engaging with them. And so there was an understanding that wives would be an important part of the missionary work. Their primary goals work conversion at this period. There was some medical work going on, but it was understood that the primary mission was just about conveying the lessons of the gospel.
Can you mentioned this, I think, a little bit earlier, but I'm very interested, and I'm sure a lot of other folks are who are watching this, in the organizational structure of the church and the missionary groups that would have been supporting the Morrisons. Can you talk a little bit more about the groups that they were affiliated as missionaries?
Sure. Initially, there was a board of foreign missions run out of New York, and they were recruited through that board, and it organized all of the activities. But of course, they were at great distance when correspondence was difficult. And so when they arrived in Ningbo, they were joining an established mission that had its own structure for operations. They also, her husband would join the Presbytery in Ningbo. They had a presbytery for disciplinary concerns should they arise and to help everyone out. At the same time, they joined a group of Protestant missionaries that would choose to coordinate their work. They had what they called a monthly concert where they would get together to talk about mission issues. And particularly among the women, there was regular coordination and social contact with people in the Baptist mission, the Methodist mission, the London Missionary Society. Basically, all the Protestant missionaries in that region would have a lot of contact.
So what was Ningbo like during the early 1860s? The Morrisons arrive in very late 1859. And how did the ongoing Taiping Rebellion shape life in the city?
So it's hard to get a sense nowadays of what life would be like. So Ningbo was shaped by two primary things. The first was it was a treaty port, and it was opened by treaty where foreigners had special privileges. It was one of 5 treaty ports that had been opened, and those special privileges were part of the setting in which the Morrisons operated. The second piece is that Chinese society was very stressed. As I talk a little bit about in the article, it was a time of overpopulation or underemployment, and that particularly impacted the women in society and the women at the low levels of society. It was heavily competitive in economic terms, and many people scrambling for a living. In that circumstance, a rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, an enormous rebellion in Chinese history, had erupted in South China and had moved up into the area or close to the area where the Morrisons were in Ningbo. And so they experienced that rebellion. The rebellion was fed by the economic distress, among other things, going on. So the rebellion impacted them in 2 particular ways. The first is it generated a tremendous number of refugees. And that's mentioned in the article about how she had opportunities to reach out to women in the refugee community whose circumstances were different than the sort of ordinary hardscrabble life. The second was that the Taiping Rebellion had developed an ideology that was based in part on missionary teachings. And as a result, they gave protection to missionaries. So missionaries themselves were rarely threatened. And so they had sort of safe passage. And that meant that a lot of refugees clustered around the missionary community in Ningbo in those circumstances. And that set up some opportunities for Mary to reach out to them in that period.
Well, one of the things that your article brings up and points out is that Mary had an extraordinary sense of sympathy for the plight of poor women in Ningbo, and you've spoken about that a little bit already. But I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how she came by sort of developing and deepening those sympathies for the poor women of Ningbo.
So Mary's contact with poor women, part of it was very direct and personal. And this has to do with social norms for middle-class women. After the birth of her first child, she actually engaged a wet nurse. And this was something that was done in the period, and it would allow her to go back to her work. But the wet nurse was from a very poor background. And so she learned a lot about the challenges for poor women. The wet nurse had 3 children, and her husband had abandoned her. And basically her work as a wet nurse was itself her means of supporting her children in a very difficult circumstance. In addition, Mary was able to observe very close hand some of the economic competition. The particular instance mentioned in the article was processing tea. And there was a job to pick out all the refuse in the tea to make it a clean product. And women would compete for that work. And she observed that competition in no uncertain terms and lamented the fact that women who so wanted to work often had little to do. And she sympathized for them. This was something that was very much on her heart.
And through her work with that community, she develops the industrial class strategy, which is something that she learns about from some work that's happening in London around the world. Can you talk a little bit about what the industrial class strategy was, and also how did Mary sort of develop that strategy over time with some starts and stops involved?
Well, let me first talk briefly about what she attempted to do. In line with her background as a teacher and as an educated woman, she thought that what would be most interesting to women as a way to get to talking about faith would be to teach them to read. And in this period, you have to understand that there are different dialects in China. So the dialect spoken in Ningbo was different than Mandarin Chinese with which we're more familiar today. The missionaries had developed a romanization to capture Ningbo dialect speech, which was not how Chinese men learned how to read. But they adopted a strategy, even more broadly in the mission, of teaching people to read the Romanized dialect because it was more readily accessible to people who did not have a standard education in Chinese characters. And so she pursued that, teaching women to read colloquial. It worked best with the refugees who had time on their hands. But even when she had a young woman, as mentioned in the article, who embraced the reading for a while, it was a big step from that to passing along the lessons of the gospel. And it didn't pan out, is basically what happened. And so she was sort of loose ends about how was she to fulfill her missionary endeavor. It was in that context that Mary Rankin, one of the fellow missionaries, got a very recently published book from London about the work of the London Bible women. And in that, it described a circumstance where poor women in the slums of London were given work so that they could sit and listen, and the Bible was read to them while they worked. And so Mary Rankin shared that book with Mary Morrison. Mary Morrison was reading through it and thought, wait a minute, this could work. We wouldn't be reading the Bible because they wouldn't understand it, but we could talk to them about the story of Jesus and about these concepts about which they had no background and no idea. Western concepts of the nature of the world and God's role in it. And then through to the story of Jesus and specific story of salvation. And so she thought, what if I do the same thing? I have them work and I'll have to set up the work. And so what she does, she consults with two Christian Chinese women who embrace the idea with her. And they say, here's the work that we can do. We can have them sew very simple things. In this case, stockings, as they call them, socks, as we would think of it. As relatively simple work, we'll pay them a very small wage, but a wage that's important to them, these poor women. And then while they're sewing, we'll talk to them about these stories and begin to help them understand things that they've never heard about before. And so that's the essence of the industrial class strategy, is to bring women in for, say, 2 hours, have them work on these sewing projects arranged by Mary Morrison and her Chinese assistants. And while they're sewing, to talk through the stories, to answer questions. And that's the industrial class strategy right there.
Well, as we spoke about, that's an innovative strategy. That's something that Mary sort of developed, as we said, based on some work that had already been happening in London, which is an amazing instance of globalization, even in the midst of the middle 19th century. I'm curious about how that strategy was received by others in China in particular, from the missionary community. You talk about this a little bit in your article, but I wonder if you could speak to the responses that Mary knew about and the conversations that happened subsequent to people learning about the strategy in China.
So this strategy came into an active debate among the men, in particular within the missionary community. Because of the challenging economic times, there was a debate among the missionaries about how finances fit into the equation. And they were concerned about what they called at the period, or the detractors called, rice Christians, meaning that the Chinese who had agreed to affirm the faith primarily because there was an economic interest. Perhaps they could get employment with the missionaries. And there were many who debated whether this was true faith, which was it was just a big issue among the men. And there were some who said we shouldn't be hiring Christians, we should just hire straight, and the Christian affirmation and baptism should be just solely based on faith. There should be no financial incentive involved. And along comes this new strategy where we pay the women. I mean, yes, they're doing work, but we pay the women to sit and listen. And in idealistic terms, this was a problem. And there were critics of the strategy who said, hey, this is you're maybe interfering with the actual truth of the gospel by confusing people's motivations. So that was one side of the equation. There were other male missionaries, and particularly women, who were tracking the problems that Mary had encountered, who said, no, this is just dealing with women where they are. They don't have time to sit down and listen to teaching. They can't just do that. Their lives don't allow that. And what this industrial class strategy does is it frees up the space in those women's lives to actually be able to hear. So it's meeting women where they are. And so there is a group of women who readily adopt this and are very excited about it. I would particularly call out Helen Nevius, who has written a lot about her experiences in China in published work later on, who was in Shandong. She had started in the Ningbo mission, so she knew, and she had visited, so she observed the classes directly. And then she took it to the north. And she later wrote a glowing report from which I excerpt some comments about how the strategy was working for her in just the ways that Mary Morrison intended. And so the strategy persisted, even with the critiques. And I have records of it as late as 1921, I found records that it was still being used in China.
Well, that's so interesting, and I think it's important that we also discuss how those perspectives are coming from the American perspective. It's coming from the missionary perspective. I know that I think that there's likely a paucity of records that could speak to the experiences of the Chinese. Do you have any sense of, as the church moves towards a local model of governance, of leadership, what the perspectives of the Chinese were, looking either back on the industrial class strategy or just on similar efforts?
That's an interesting question. And as you said, there are very few records. And certainly the women involved on the Chinese side, very few of them were literate, even in the Romanized colloquial. So we have very few records of how Chinese women perceive this, except for the two helpers who embraced the strategy and understood it. So that would be an indication that women who were already committed to the Christian faith and were thinking about how to reach their compatriots, particularly the poor women, how they understood very quickly how this was a good fit. Beyond that, we have almost no records. I guess the records that women embrace this. Helen Nevius's classes could be up to 100. But that's in the broader population of China, that's still not very, very large. Chinese today are probably not aware of this. Some of the ones who've worked on mission history may have encountered it, but as far as I'm tracking, no one else has really picked up on this. Part of the reason for that is that it was a terrible time in the history of China. And if you're telling the story of China, just how poor it was and how people struggled may not be something that the Chinese are looking to celebrate. But they've come out of that time. And so I think there's opportunities here, but this is not an area, to the best of my knowledge, that has been explored.
Well, it's such a fascinating story. I wonder if you would speak to your thoughts on what people in 2020 can sort of learn from the experiences of Mary Morrison, what we can draw on for lessons for the various works that we're doing in 2020.
So what strikes me is that debate about whether we're very purist or whether we engage with people where they are. And I find Mary's method here, which is absolutely engaging the women where they were in the realities of their life, I find that compelling. And I think that that's something, the circumstances of life now could be very different, but it's important to meet people where they are. So for me, that's the lesson right there. And watching her do it and watching her get excited with it and her understanding that that's what she was doing, I find inspiring.
Indeed. One last question for you, Tom. This research that you've done was in large part, as I understand it, thanks to the correspondence that you were able to get access to from Mary Morrison, and that was a process that was very much aided by the descendants of Mary Morrison. So there are correspondence that were not currently in the Presbyterian Historical Society, but with your great assistance, we're hoping to be able to bring into the National Archives. Can you tell us a little bit about that research journey that you've taken with regards to the correspondence, especially about or from Mary Morrison, and then a little bit about what you're planning to work on next with regards to her life story?
So this whole project began when the letters surfaced. The family reached out to a friend of mine in the library at West Point because they were local there and said, we have these letters. And because I was the China person and they involved China, they got in touch with me. And when I got into the letters, I was fascinated. I'm a lifelong Presbyterian. And here was the story of Presbyterians heading off to the coast of China when that was frankly a little bit adventurous. And as I got into the letters, it was just fascinating to me what they encountered and what was going on. Now, my initial take was to look at the mission, which is very interesting in its own right. And at some point I will come back to that. But when I was looking into the backstory of Mary Morrison and Thomas Morrison, I ran across her obituary from 1917, quite late, by her daughter that described her whole life. And it was fascinating. She raised 4 children after her husband's death on her own. She came back to the States to get them educated, set up a school. That should be very much in line with what she did, what she was trained to do. Once she got them educated, she wanted to go back to China, but wasn't able to for a variety of reasons. Ended up in the home mission to Appalachia in the hills of Western North Carolina. It's a wonderful story. So that's where my research is going to go. But at the beginning, it was just those letters. And I suspect that there are other letters out there. Just from their correspondence, her husband's side of the family should have a big stack of letters if they preserved them. And I would love to see those. But so far, no luck turning those up. So for those families who have these kind of resources, you may not realize that there are others of us, even though we're outside the family, who can find and put these letters in context. So I was in touch with the family and said, these letters really should be more broadly available because I've asked questions that they shed light on, but others also may be interested. And so the family has already been in touch with the Historical Society about depositing the letters there so that they can be available. Now, when I was looking at this, I mentioned Mary Rankin and her role. Well, the Presbyterian Historical Society has the papers of her husband. And so I've been there and I've been through his journal and looked at their interactions from that context. This is the kind of work that we do. So it is really helpful to all of us if a family can entrust their letters to something like the Presbyterian Historical Society so that we can build a picture and help you all understand those crazy and wonderful things that happened back in the day.
Well, that's great, Tom. Thank you so much for telling us about those letters and also discussing your wonderful article in the journal. I just want to give one more reminder to everybody who is out there that you can read the full text of Tom's article in the spring-summer 2020 issue of the Journal of Presbyterian History. And at the end of this video, we are going to go ahead and park a link to the journal so that you can click directly to it. I once again want to thank you, Tom, for taking the time today to speak to us about Mary Morrison, about the industrial class strategy, and about mission history to China. Please, everybody, be well out there and be in touch with PHS if there's anything that we can help you with in the coming days. So thanks and goodbye for now.